All right, everybody. Welcome to Philosophy Book Club. We're going through John Rawls' A Theory of Justice. We're on Chapter 2. This is a redo. We had some audio issues the first time around, but hopefully we'll get through this. Hopefully more people join us. I've got Luke here on the chat, and hopefully he can join us. If he can get his mic working, but we'll see. So Chapter 2 starts off with institutions and formal justice, and he explains that only realized things can be just or unjust. So abstract concepts, you can't apply those properties to that, because I guess he thinks that they actually have to be sort of in action in order to do just or unjust. The first sections are about finely detailing what institutions are and how they operate generally. And so he includes several other things. So government institutions are obviously a part of what he considers that, but he also considers to some degree businesses to be institutions, or at least that's my interpretation of it. He talks about free markets a lot, and he says that the rules of the system, they should have these equalities and inequalities in them, but in principles that we'll go over, he also says that there should be sort of an equality of opportunity. But basically, he says, I think he phrases it careers open to all, but he also has several other ways of putting that forward. Luke, I can hear you. Your mic sounds good.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, cool. Sort of what I recall in regards to here with this discussion was kind of like he's okay with sort of imbalances in wealth and whatnot in the system, as long as that those imbalances exist to make it better for everybody at every stage, sort of thing. So if better wages or whatnot spur innovation and everybody lives in a better society, then it's okay to have people and things like that, is kind of how I'd heard it framed. So.
Yeah, part of, I think it's his difference principle, which we'll go over near the middle of the chapter. It's not just that it's good for everyone, but that it is most advantageous to the people who are least in the society, so the people who have the worst sort of moral luck in life.
Okay.
That anything that the highest tier people are gaining, that needs to advantage the lowest group. So this section is about formal justice, and he sort of says that formal justice is the adherence to principles, and so consistency and regularity in the administration of institutions, and the principles must be themselves just. He is basically talking about formal justice is the consistency of sticking to the principles and sticking to the rules of the society, so that anyone in the society at any point can understand what they can and can't do within the society. And he says that unjust societies are unlikely to hold to formal justice, so he thinks that any society that we would call unjust, that they would be inconsistent and irregular, and would not stick to any, even if they purported to stick to principles, it's unlikely that they would be doing it, because he thinks if you are being just, then you are sort of sticking to your principles. If you're being unjust, you're not sticking to principles, or at least your principles are not about sticking to them. They don't hold that rule about them. He also talks about how institutional rules or institutional principles and individual principles are entirely different. So you would want to structure your formal institution in such a way, but then also you would have a separate set of sort of socially oriented rules, and he goes on to that later. And he specifically calls the individual rules duties. But again, we'll get to that later. Do you have anything more on that, Luke?
No, I think that makes sense. Like, it's kind of like, what we got to think about where people in politics right now are like stretching the rules of things. Mm-hmm. They're not acting within, the spirit of the law, and that's where it feels really unjust. Like, we have Trump doing things that are legal but dubious. We have Rob Ford doing things that are legal but dubious. We have a lot of politicians that are really stretching the rules right now, and they feel really unfair in terms of like the law. Mm-hmm. And we have to look at like how laws are so often like unfairly applied to different demographics, and like that right there is a pretty big injustice. And like in terms of the the feeling of the law, or the spirit of the law, we should be kind of justice should be blind is kind of the old adage, and it definitely isn't.
Yeah, I think you're entirely right. I think the thing that is really getting in people's craw nowadays is the inconsistency. And Rawls has a thing about whether or not, if you are living in a just society, whether or not you need to participate in it, sort of. All right, well, let's go on to the next section. This is where he's talking about his 2 principles of justice, which is what the chapter's about. And he's going to provisionally lay them out. And the first one is, each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties compatible with a similar scheme of liberties for others. And then the second principle is social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. And you'll notice he uses the to be to everyone's advantage. He goes on to explain and revise that to it is expected to be to the most advantage of the least advantage. Each person is to have an equal right. Oh, I already said that. So he talks about what the basic liberties are, and these are political liberty and freedom of speech and assembly, liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person, and so no psychological oppression, assault, or taking of your personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure. And thinking about those are very, I don't know that I would say that they're Lockean, but they're definitely American. I think that basically, like, those basic liberties are what the Founding Fathers thought the Constitution was giving us.
Yeah, they're very like freedom of the mind type, freedom of speech. Because there's some freedom of speech where it's not so much you can't think that, it's just you can't say it out loud, and then there's some stuff that's kind of a little bit different, and that's definitely more in the falling into the you can never really police people's thoughts type thing. Mm-hmm. And it's like at a certain point there's always has to be reasonable limits to freedom of speech, obviously, to protect people in a society, because obviously, but like those are very like freedom of the mind, freedom of thought policing type stuff he's discussing there. So it's all pretty like almost everybody can get behind that level of freedom of speech. Nobody's going to be able to be like, hey, you should think differently, even though social pressure could be on you to think differently. Nobody from the government's going to come tell you to say you're wrong. It's just people might tell you you're wrong. So
it always irks me when people sort of they confuse, or at least they try to levy freedom of speech to mean like freedom from criticism. That always really bothers me.
Yeah, that's really the worst perversion of it, because it's like that's the thing. Like, the only solution to free speech is more free speech, right? That's the oldest adage in the book. So if you can't be criticized for your shitty ideas, then like you're not allowing people to have their freedom of speech back. It's terrible.
Yeah. He says that basic liberties cannot be infringed upon based on increased social or economic advantages. So you cannot, you are not to trade those liberties for higher social position or higher money, essentially, or more pay, anything like that. They can only be limited insofar as they may conflict with other liberties. So as you were saying, like, our freedom of speech is not unlimited, because there are times when that could be psychological oppression, like he talks about, or it could instigate assault on your person, and things like that. As a point about consistency, however the rights may be adjusted, they must be adjusted for everyone. So no particular group or individual's rights can be changed. Just them. Has to be everyone. And he says one form of injustice is inequalities that are not to the benefit of everyone, which I think is very consistent with what he talks about. All right. The next section is interpretations of the second principle. So he thinks the social and economic equalities are to be arranged so that they are both to be for everyone's benefit and attached positions and offices. He thinks that there are many different ways that people could take that, and he wants to steer them specifically towards one or maybe two of the interpretations. And so he says he wants roughly a free market system, but the means of productions may or may not be privately owned. And I was when I was speaking with Aaron about this, because I was very confused, because throughout this chapter you'll hear him talk about the system needs to be a free market, but certain things can be regulated. But the things he says are regulated are, for instance, that like the means of production may or may not be in the hands of the people. That later on it'll say the amount of things could be capped, or like quotas. Like when we think communism, I think the quotas and all that. But really, I was just confused how exactly is a free market operating in that kind of situation. And Aaron had a really good point, and it's what would create the free market part of it is that everyone would sort of have an equal access to resources and equal access to the means of production. But what would create the competition in there is your efficiency to bring it to market, and also the type of product that you're making. And then that'll create the competition in this sort of market system. And I thought that was a good point.
Yeah, that's fair. That's like going into like a very direct meritocracy, as opposed to having like any sort of nepotism or existing capital that you can bring into the system. Everybody can kind of start at a similar point and then just bring their skills to it, from the sounds of things. Mm-hmm. So, that's kind of what I think. That's what I think a lot of people think capitalism is. When they don't think about, all of the externalities. They think capitalism is, I'm going to be the best at my job, so blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I think it's a lot more like, yeah, that's the very enlightened mode of capitalism that I quite enjoy. The like, let's adjust for all the externalities and try and balance things out so everybody has an equal playing field. And then we, let people have the, free market there, where the best do the best. As long as we bring everybody up to an equal starting point, then everything's cool, right?
Oh yeah.
So,
This is where he goes over that positions are open to those able and willing to strive for them, and that this will lead to a just distribution. I had thought, because later on he talks about that he does not think that this will create a meritocracy, because he sort of predicts that that's what people's he predicts that that is what people will say about it, but he does not think it'll be a meritocracy, because, well, we'll get to that later. But
that's okay. That's really interesting.
Yeah, because it was sort of confusing, because it kind of seems like, yeah, wouldn't it be a meritocracy if you're just saying, okay, we're all gonna go out for this thing and anyone can try to get in on it. But again, we'll get to it, but he doesn't land on that. This is where he brings up, he has several ways in which he tries to cash out the second principle, and the first one is the principle of efficiency. And he says this is a scheme where you can do better in one way without doing worse in another. And so it shows this graph here, and if I can hold this up properly. So the x-axis would be one person, and the y-axis would be another. This curve represents the most just distribution within that. So if you were to exceed that, it would be unjust for one or the other party. And of course, you don't see numbers here. He's just saying that that should be the way in which we think about the distribution.
Yeah, it's not like game theory, right? You just kind of assign like values that kind of make sense of stuff, and it doesn't need to be a specific number, but it's kind of like, let's kind of give stuff some fair value, and it should kind of give us a representation of it.
Exactly, yeah. He's just trying to represent the concept. And he thinks that there's, fields of values within there, because he thinks that a 45-degree line through the graph that way is supposed to represent a completely equal distribution of whatever it is between the two people, and so it goes up. But the principle isn't about that. The principle is about if one person gains, another person should in some way commensurately gain. Well, maybe not commensurate, because I think that means 1-to-1. But they should gain in some sense. And he's saying if you want to stick to something like that, that distribution curve is the most just. And anything inside or outside of it, like outside of it, I think is what he says would be unjust, and inside of it, let's see, superior all points, point D. Yeah, the interior points that represent just distribution will generally be preferred to efficient points. Okay, that's interesting.
My thoughts on the graph is it's kind of inverse to like a quadratic formula, where you have like super vertical and then super horizontal at the other side, and that like quadratic kind of makes us think how our wealth is actually distributed right now, where like the people at the the people at the highest percentages have the absolute most, 'cause that's where the graph is the steepest. And like, yeah, his kind of graph of distribution would be far more balanced, where it's like it's a bit better at one side or the other, but it's not like the absolute extremes of sustenance farming poverty to billionaireship. So it's like, yeah, that makes sense. Right. I think.
Yeah, and if you like that graph, we'll get to it. He gets to the difference principle and the graphs involved in that, which I think are really fascinating. On as a part of that graph, or at least a part of the concept of efficiency, he lays out that he actually thinks that the principle of efficiency will not lead to the kind of just system that he's trying to lay out here. And so he brings up that serfdom, that sort of economic system, is probably efficient, but also probably not just. And so, where did he bring that up? Oh yeah, and he also brings up natural aristocracy, where he thinks that people who are born with high intellect or high physical ability, they will naturally become higher tiered people in the society. And that's why it's called natural aristocracy. Those people will just become that, and that is why he does not think, or he doesn't want a natural aristocracy to occur if it's not feeding those benefits back to the least advantaged. And again, we'll go over that in the next section, which is where he goes over the difference principle. So he talks about the liberal conception. Okay, here we go. So these would be the liberal elements. This would be determined by a natural distribution of abilities and talents. You want to prevent excessive accumulation of property and wealth. You want equal opportunities for education, and you want equal access to cultural knowledge and skills. Whereas a natural aristocracy would be the unregulated social contingencies, or the unregulated gain from your natural abilities. But you would limit the gain from those natural abilities as long as it furthered the good of the poorest sector. And he actually doesn't like either. So he says we shouldn't let our principle of distribution be determined by natural aristocracy or the liberal conception. Because he says they both seem equally arbitrary. He says that they are unstable. We are troubled by the influence of either social contingencies or natural chance on the determination of distributive shares. And we should be bothered by the influence of the other. Yeah. So he's saying in both of those systems, you would still have well-off people unequally rising to the top, sort of.
Yeah, that's fair. Like system where you either have, kind of try to equal everything out for everyone. You will either have people being pulled down and not benefiting every society the most because people are being underutilized, and you will have people people being overutilized at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So let's move on to the next section. So he didn't like those two, the liberal conception or natural aristocracy, and so he thinks that democratic equality, which he will just call the democratic interpretation, which he breaks into two pieces, which is the fair equality of opportunity and the difference principle. And this section is called democratic equality and the difference principle. The social order is not to establish and secure the mere attractive prospects of those better off, unless doing so advantages the least fortunate. And that is where he brings these graphs into play. This is how he thinks the difference principle distribution would be. And basically, if you were to create a curve on this graph, which represented the that same wide curve from the other graph, if you were to create that line on here, he says only these vertical and horizontal lines are the just distributions. So any line that you create should attempt to approach one of those lines. And you can see that in this graph. The reason that it cuts in half and you don't get this field is that there will undoubtedly be more people who are least advantaged than sort of more advantaged. So, it's likely that it will never be this. You'll basically never get into this area. You'll only ever be in a distribution lower down.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have to sort of load your graph one way or the other, because you'll never have as much people living in extreme poverty as people living in extreme wealth.
Right.
Like, yeah.
All right. He has another section talking about utilitarianism. He says utilitarianism is indifferent to how a... Boy, I can't read my own writing. It is indifferent to how a constant sum of benefits is distributed. It only breaks ties. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's indifferent to how a constant sum of benefits is distributed. It appeals to equality only to break ties. If there are but two persons, that's fine, Luke. Then assuming an interpersonal cardinal interpretation of the axes, the utilitarian's indifference lines for distributions are straight lines perpendicular to the 45-degree line. And since those are representative men, it has to be weighted by the numbers they each represent. And so it's this graph here. So you can see that these are perfectly horizontal, and these ones bend downwardly, and that he doesn't think... I have a hard time interpreting these graphs, but he doesn't think that this is a just distribution, and that utilitarianism would only be there to settle disputes between the two. Okay. If the difference principle was applied to the relationship between an entrepreneurial class and laborers, anything that would improve the entrepreneur's expectations would encourage them to improve that of the laborers. This is something I brought up. This is if you... so it's like trickle-down economics, but it's as if you designed it to work, or if you forced it to work. And so conservatives, they would implement this sort of trickle-down thing. Oh, we'll make sure that the entrepreneurial class, the bosses, the companies, they will get as much money, and that hopefully they will pay their people more or hire more people, etc., etc. And so that hinges on the hope that that group will do more with the money instead of keep it. Whereas this distribution is, we are going to let them get more money, but we are also going to say, hey, if you get more money, you are going to need to pay people more or hire more people, etc., etc. He says that the principle of justice is, of course, prior to the principle of efficiency, or prior to efficiency generally. And he says any changes that may need to occur to ensure justice, they may not be efficient, and we sort of need to eat that because justice is prior to efficiency. It's better to be just than efficient. The difference principle doesn't attend to the initial positions, only subsequent variations in the positions. So where if you have two distributions, one person starts off here, one person starts off here, it is not seeking to equalize the positions. It is only meant to, if this one goes up, this one goes up by a similar amount, or I forget if he talks about. Well, I think he just goes over that we would figure out what the amount is that changes, but that we want anyone here to go up as long as the bottommost also goes up a lot. Let's see.
Yeah, the comment on efficiency versus justice is like why we need business regulation, because like the most efficient system is the one that has slaves, and
right? Yeah.
And the one that actually benefits all of us and doesn't have slavery and doesn't have us being delimbed and poisoned at work is probably the better system for all of us compared to unbridled capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, capitalism without justice would just be slavery.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he says, assume that changing one changes all, but not necessarily together. So he's not saying that that it would be a 1-to-1 raising. I think he assumes that the bottom will raise more than the top. Or at least that there would be a gradient difference, because he also says later what he calls chain where is it chain connection, where he talks about we're not just talking about if the high goes up, the lowest needs to go up as well. He assumes that if we raise this up, every gradation downward towards the low will also travel upward to some extent. So maybe the top goes up a little, the middlingly goes up, and the bottom goes up the most.
Sort of like a proportional increase as opposed to like a linear increase.
Yep. So, in light of the difference principle, he rewrites the second principle to be: inequalities are to be arranged so that the greatest expected benefit of the least advantaged, and inequalities are to be arranged so that they... Hold on, let me make sure I'm reading this right. Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both the greatest expected benefit of the least advantaged, and they are attached to offices and positions open to all under the conditions of equality of opportunity. Excuse me. Does he go over? No. Okay. So the next section is where he goes fair equality of opportunity. What did you say?
Sorry, I said how very Marxist of him.
Yeah, I actually, I haven't read Marx. It's coming up in my ethics class that I'm taking, so I'm really excited about that.
Gotcha. Yeah, I haven't read much of it. I just know that like the equality of outcomes, the equality of opportunity is kind of one of the primary tenets of it. So.
Oh, okay. Good. He takes a second to talk about the Maximin principle, which is essentially when the difference principle is applied to economics in general, and he does not want to mix those two terms because of that, because the Maximin principle is generally understood as a rule for choice under great uncertainty, whereas the difference principle is a principle of justice. So he does not want to, I don't think he wants to make it seem that that our using of the difference principle in this case is about uncertainty, or that you would be assuming very high risk by using it. All right. So the next section is fair equality of opportunity and pure procedural justice. This is where he says that he does not think that this will be meritocratic. Let's see where he explains that. He has not maintained that offices must be open if in fact everyone is to benefit from an arrangement, for it may be possible to improve everyone's situation by assigning certain powers and benefits to positions, despite the fact that certain groups are excluded from them. Although access is restricted, perhaps these offices can still attract superior talent and encourage better performance. But the principle of open position forbids this. So he does not think that that is how it would operate. It expresses the conviction that if some places were not open on a basis of fair to all, those kept out would be right in feeling unjustly treated, even though they benefited from the greater efforts of those who were allowed to hold them. Right. So he does not think that positions should be restricted in any way. So basically anyone can go out for any position. And should be rightly considered for those positions, because even if the best people would have gotten those positions and everyone would have benefited from them, it would have been unjust that not everyone was able to go out for them.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, so I guess that kind of means it's you let everybody apply for the job, and whoever gets hired is at the choice of the manager, the person making kind of the judgment call, as opposed to a pure meritocracy where everybody puts their resumes in a supercomputer, they all chug them in, and we say this is the best candidate. So this is more, it's still just taking a more human approach to a similar idea, right? You still have a manager who's picking the best candidate, but it may not necessarily be the most meritocratic candidate.
Right.
Okay.
And he definitely explains it, as he said in the last chapter, that justice over efficiency, that we are doing sort of the right thing, even though it may not be the most advantageous thing.
Yeah, that's fair. Like that's like a good conversation to have about affirmative action type stuff, where it's like
I think that's exactly what he's talking about here. Yeah.
Where like a lot of people seem to like to think where it's like the absolute best will get the job because the only ones will be qualified, but in reality, like there'll be hundreds of qualified candidates to fill every job. Yeah. So like if we're tipping the scale slightly to even out a social inequality, it's irrelevant in terms of like actual efficiencies, because like it's better on justice. But efficiencies don't matter, because for every job out there, there's hundreds of qualified people. Like, that's just, people like to think they're special, and they are.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because I think, I don't, there's crazy libertarians, and then there's the more down-to-earth libertarians. So I'm wondering, with libertarian thought, where they come out on this sort of issue, I feel like they tip toward efficiency and not justice, but they may not also see it as a just, unjust situation, because they don't think that the government should be making that kind of determination, I think. But who knows? Yeah. Actually, I have several who I think are down to earth. They're not crazy about it, who are libertarians. I'd actually like to have a sort of sit-down conversation about this sort of stuff with them.
Yeah, that's fair. I've got a couple of libertarian tendencies, and it's like I try and keep them out because most libertarian tendencies get pretty crazy, but I've got a few libertarian tendencies, and it's just like, yeah, I try and balance it between the two things, and it's kind of an interesting match.
Yeah, I think it's a very attractive thing, because I was definitely, at least felt that I was very libertarian coming like right out of high school and early in my college career. I would have definitely, if you had asked me like what is your political persuasion, I probably would have given the I'm fiscally conservative and socially liberal.
Yeah, that's the easy thing for that's the easy thing for everyone to say. And
look, gays and weed, but we got to stop spending so much.
Yeah, and like it's it's funny now that we talk about like the balance between efficiency and justice. It's funny because like I'm definitely a justice-leaning libertarian. Like for me, like I'm a libertarian when it comes to like let's put in a fat and sugar tax. I'm like, no, let people eat what they want. Like that's my kind of libertarianism. Or like it's just like the government, or even like really high tobacco tax and stuff like that. Like, I understand they're a public health measure, but at the same time, like, there's a part of inside of me, it's like the government shouldn't be able to tell you what to do in that part. You should be able to be as unhealthy as you want.
Yeah.
That's, sort of the, silliness of my libertarian mentality, and that's what as far as it goes. And that's a maximizing freedom without taking away anybody else's liberty or justice sort of mode. You know what I mean? So
yeah, I have those inclinations as well, and I think they're like it's a balance that you try to strike, because I don't want wasteful government spending either. Like, I don't want to be throwing money at something if they're just throwing the money away also.
Yeah. Although, I think ultimately the straw man is, the idea is people, the idea is that the libertarians want responsible spending, which means that the other people aren't doing responsible spending.
Right.
Literally everybody wants responsible spending. Democrats want responsible spending. NDP want responsible spending. Everybody wants responsible spending. It's just a difference in definition of what that is. So it's like the Conservatives campaign on responsible spending, but literally everybody else actually does responsible spending. It's just where you draw the line, right? It's just kind of one of those funny, talking pieces that doesn't mean much, right?
Yeah. So he talks about perfect procedural justice, and he thinks he explains that this is that all the rules that we put in place, that they are going to always we are creating just rules, and they should create just outcomes. And he says that this is nearly impossible to realize. Like, it should be a goal, but we're almost definitely not going to meet the goal. Because he talks about how he talks about imperfect procedural justice and things that we have already. So, for instance, criminal trials, or the justice system, is an imperfect procedural thing, because we would say that the trial is carried out in a just way and all that kind of stuff, but it could still be the case that murderers go free and innocent people are put in jail, because it's there's just different arrangements, and he says different arrangements may be reasonably expected in different circumstance. At least, he says, not always, but at least most of the time. It's an instance of imperfect procedural justice. Even though the law is carefully followed and the proceedings are fairly and properly conducted, it might reach a wrong outcome.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Like, that's with the legal system. Like, you hear almost every day about really bad inconsistencies in the legal system, but you always hear about, like, one or two sort of fringe stories that pop up, and they're like, these are really outrage-inducing. You hear about the person convicted of sex crimes that gets away with it, or gets away with a short sentence, or you get a lot of these really controversial things. But, like, for the most part, it's always public opinion thinking about, like, okay, how much should this person be punished or whatnot. But for the most part, as much as everybody wants to have a gut feeling about these such things, it's like, it's better to look at, like, an evidence-based approach to justice and an evidence-based approach to these kind of things, where, like, if sometimes if it produces better outcomes, that we're not slapping people with a bunch of jail time, or for this reason this person got off or whatnot. Sometimes it's really best to defer to experts on things like this, where it's like, it can be really what everybody feels is just in their stomach, because it's really hard for it's hard for most people to really look at, like, okay, you hear about a crime, most people can't, like, actually go and give a very good objective view if they're a lawyer, unless they're a lawyer or a judge or something, about, like, what is actively just, or, like, in comparison to the other cases that we've tried and whatnot, because that's kind of the only way that I think we can make a good, like, not gut feeling opinion from, like, one case to the next. You have to look at how every other case is determined. The whole stare decisis thing. Yeah. So like, it's just kind of interesting that we need to be a bit more kind of open, or sorry, we need to be more evidence based. We need to look more at like how other things go in that regard, rather than going with a gut feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I think consistency also. I think that's probably the biggest part, because I mean we talk about on OA they talk about the different circuits, and this one's a conservative circuit and this one's a more liberal circuit, and then there's the most liberal circuit, the Ninth Circuit, and then that always strikes me as odd. It's like that is a huge inconsistency, that you can choose where to have your case, and just based on where you chose, you could have a radically different outcome.
Like I think the one balancing point there is that like sentencing matrices or sentencing guidelines are pretty consistent from like state to state. Like I mean, or sorry,
like that's like for the federal level, isn't it?
So like,
but I suppose that is the circuit courts also.
Like federal level, I think it's somewhat consistent. And I think, like even state to state for a lot of stuff, it is consistent.
There's also
like there are still obviously disparities based on what states thinks is more important or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is a little bit of standardization between that stuff.
Okay.
But like it's not to say there's no inconsistencies, but there's that.
Sure. That's good. Let's see what we got here. This is where he starts to get into more of the free market stuff, where he was talking about that maybe production would be regulated. Let me see here. Excuse me. All right, I think I'll skip over that part because he talks about. I guess it goes into it. So. This happened the last time. I don't really know how to say this word. It's allocative, like allocate. So allocative justice. I guess that's probably the best way to say it. He's saying that, would be utilitarianism, and it wouldn't care about procedural justice because the institutions are imperfect arrangements to distribute satisfaction. Let's see. He says that basically systems that would just be to try to maximize satisfaction would not be perfect. He says they would be imperfect. Let's see. Yeah, because justice becomes a kind of. It says justice becomes a kind of efficiency unless equality is preferred, and if you were to generalize that, so the allocative conception leads to the classical utilitarian view. It assimilates justice to the benevolence of the impartial spectator, and the latter in turn to the most efficient design of institutions to promote the greatest balance of satisfaction. So utilitarianism does not interpret the basic structure as a scheme of pure procedural justice. For the utilitarian, in principle anyway, an independent standard for judging all distributions, namely whether they produce the greatest net balance of satisfaction. So he's saying they don't lead to perfect procedural justice because justice is not its intent. It's just maximizing satisfaction. So you shouldn't want allocative justice. Stock of benefits. And he's saying in pure procedural justice, the distribution of advantages, they are not appraised in the first instance by confronting the stock of benefits. Basically, the justice that's equality is, I guess this again is the justice over efficiency argument for him. It doesn't matter if we're getting more out of it if it's unjust. And he thinks they are. So as much as he thinks that his two principles are lexically ordered, so that the first principle has to be satisfied before the second principle can even be thought of. And if you have not satisfied the first principle, it doesn't matter if you satisfy the second principle. He also thinks that the two parts of the second principle are also lexically ordered, and so you I keep losing my page. So if you do not organize inequalities so that they are the greatest expected benefit to the least advantage, it doesn't matter that you have attached those benefits to offices and positions open to all. And this is where I was trying to sum up what he was saying about this distribution. And so I tried, this is my sort of summation of it. The system we are setting up should be there to help you in your projects of worth and not hinder you in your projects of worth. The distribution from high to low does not affect the high very much or in an immoral way, and so the high tier will still be able to carry out their projects, but we are shifting that advantage to the lower tier so that they can carry on their projects. And so even if we are shifting from high to low, those in the sort of high tier will still be able to carry out their projects of worth in a meaningful way, but that we are shifting it down so that those in the lowest tier, the least advantaged, would have a greater ability to carry on their projects that they otherwise wouldn't.
That's a perfect explanation of progressive taxation.
Yeah. Yeah, we had that's one of the sort of things I'm most disappointed that we lost Aaron's audio from the last time, because I thought we had a really great back and forth about liberalism. The more I read this book, the more it's just like, here's liberalism and progressivism and why it's correct.
I mean, that's why they call Rawls the forefather of modern liberalism.
Yeah, I'm interested to think if anyone's I'm sure people are writing about it, but if someone's really picked up the torch and written, not a crazy volume like this, but something similar. I'm sure they have, but someone who just really lays it out so that people can absorb the message better. Because I'm just now sort of getting used to reading these sorts of texts. The more you read it, the more you get how he says things. But I could definitely see that this is, in many ways, impenetrable to some people.
I can see that. Honestly, the book seems like it's a lot of really good backing up, really good justification of all of the arguments. Mm-hmm. But you can sit down and car sales pitch Rawls' theory of justice, and people are convinced in 2 minutes. I have laid it out to friends in 3 text messages while we're just bullshit discussing stuff during the day. Yeah. I've laid out the theory of justice in a couple of text messages, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, that's actually really fucking clever." And it's okay, yeah. So it's, you can definitely do an amended version of this. This does a very good job of justifying and covering all of the arguments against. Mm-hmm. But if you want to make a really digestible version of it, you don't need all of the arguments against.
Yeah, that's actually what I thought of when at the early episode of OA where Andrew and Aaron talked about the book and the concept. I thought they did a really good job of hitting all the major points.
They really, really do. And I've really the majority of what I've read about this has been from the Wikipedia page and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And when I asked Aaron, hey, where should I go to read about it? He's like, Wikipedia. I was Wikipedia or buy the book. And
nice. So for the next section, it's called Primary Social Goods as the Basis of Expectations. and I wrote utilitarianism is bad and you should feel bad. Because throughout the book he's comparing what he's laying out to utilitarianism, and how he does not think that utilitarianism is a good way of doing things. Now he's working specifically off the classical rendition of utilitarianism, which is just about, greatest good for the greatest number. There are no side constraints. There are no, baselines, nothing like that.
Yeah, maximize efficiency in spite of justice.
Yeah, exactly. So he starts off, the reason utilitarianism is bad and you should feel bad is because utilitarianism lost my train of thought. So he doesn't think that utilitarianism will set up your expectations properly, and I think this is another nod to he wants the institutions to be consistent, and you should understand what you're getting out of it if you put into it, sort of thing. He's saying utilitarianism assumes a fairly accurate measure of utility. It is that it would be necessary to have some cardinal measure for each representative individually, and some way of correlating the scales between different persons, if we are to say that the gains of some are outweighed by the losses of others, but however, it is unreasonable to demand great precision, yet the estimates cannot be left to our unguided intuition. And he talks in the first chapter about intuitionism, about how he doesn't want any principles that are based on us going, yeah, that sounds right. So he wants them to be based on ethical or other notions, but he does not want bias and self-interest. Which would put the validity into question.
It's usually said, like what he's saying there is like, you can't just look at things from an efficiency point. You need to do proper studies. You need to kind of look at it from multiple angles to make sure that you can't just look at things from one angle. You need to look at things you need to do a proper governmental study where you actually do sociological review. You talk to the population. You do all of these different things. You need to try and ultimately still need to make a judgment call about what is best in this or this, but it's that you should try and load yourself up with the best information possible.
Yeah, he says for those judgments we should find some objective grounds for those comparisons, and that they should be ones that men recognize and agree to. So yeah, exactly what you were saying. With that being said, he is saying that the difference principle, which is a part of his second principle, that it has a strong objective basis for this, which is you need to find the least advantaged person and just understand their well-being, and then you can totally understand. Once you have that sort of as the baseline and you understand what well-being is, you understand all the gradations above that. Let's see. He talks about primary goods, and primary social goods are your means to greater success in carrying out your intentions. I talked to Aaron, so he tends to use intentions or plans to talk about sort of what you want to do with your life, but I actually rather prefer Aaron's projects of worth, which is why that's what I put into my summation of it. I prefer that because it makes it sound, it's sort of, it takes Rawls' use of intention, but it also makes it seem like it's an ongoing thing, and that I don't know. I just as a marketing term, I think it's better than intentions or plans. So he says the social goods are rights, liberties, opportunities, income, and wealth. And so when you're making your comparisons, interpersonal comparisons, you make them in terms of your expectations of those primary social goods. So one man's expectations are greater than another's if this index for someone in his position is greater. Primary goods that were marked. And these things are supposed that a rational man definitely wants these regardless of whatever else he may want. So he's sort of defining rights, liberties, opportunities, incomes as well as like the primary set of things that one would want in lieu of anything else. Sometimes it's hard to skim Rawls because he's being so fine-grained and specific that he'll take an entire paragraph to define what he means when he's using a word.
That's fair. There's definitely some stuff that's very much speed readable, and some stuff that is not.
Yeah, which I appreciate. I mean, in philosophy, you definitely want to know precisely what words mean when you're making things to scotch any objections.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, I think I'll skip that. So he says, what is good is the satisfaction of rational desire. So men share in primary goods. Okay, so this is how he talks about the difference principle relating to the primary social goods. So men share in primary goods on the principle that some can have more if they are acquired in ways which improve the situation of the least favored. So every time he talks about a situation, he's trying to relate the first half of the second principle to that situation. And in this case, the distribution of the primary goods. So some can have more of those primary social goods if in garnering more of those things, they also improve the least favored. In this case, is what he says. So more of that justice over efficiency and the distribution from high to low, as you said, the progressive taxation. He says the least favored person is easy to figure out also. All right, that was a pretty short section. The next section is called Relevant Social Positions. And so he says the social structure is to regulate the natural inequalities and the benefits of social cooperation. Let's see. He says not all social positions are relevant. So he doesn't want to think of a job as a multiplicity of that job. So if you were to talk about farmers, there are dairy farmers, wheat farmers, farmers working on large tracts of land, some on small. And you can do that for many different jobs. And so if you want to have a coherent and manageable theory, you have to take all of the different jobs into account and not try to make sort of separate rules for separate sets. Because the assessment of so many competing claims is impossible. Therefore, we need to identify certain positions as more basic than the others and as providing an appropriate standpoint for judging the social system. And so the choice of these positions becomes a part of the theory of justice. But how are we to identify them? That's interesting. I actually took very few notes on this specific area. Let's see what we got here. We must keep in mind that the fundamental problem of justice and the manner in which the two principles cope with it. So the primary subject of justice, as he's emphasized, is the basic structure. And the reason for this is that its effects are so profound and pervasive and present at birth. It favors some starting places over others in the division of benefits of social cooperation. So this is that, okay, yeah. So this section is sort of about moral luck and how we should think about the various, so he calls them social contingencies, and they are family and class origins, natural endowments, and fortune and luck, which is essentially so a person who's simply by circumstance had a much better time than someone who's had a much worse time. We should take that into account as well. So someone who was maybe equally set up, but again, just through circumstance, has come out much least favored in whatever that is. And so he wants to think of the general starting point for everybody as equal citizenship. This position is defined by the rights and liberties required by the principle of equal liberty and the principle of fair and equal opportunity. And so when you satisfy those two principles, everyone is an equal citizen, and so everyone holds that position. It defines a general point of view, and the way in which you adjudicate problems between the basic liberties are settled by reference to our equal citizenship. And he goes over this in chapter 4, so we won't go over that much further. If your rights are based on your natural characteristics, and that singled you out for relevant positions, this could only hold if their gain was to the benefit of the disadvantaged. This is another section where he's talking about the first part of the second principle again, but this time, basically, if we are going to say that there is a position where we do want it to be somewhat meritocratic, we need to find a way that benefits those whom are disadvantaged in that way. He brings up the free market again, and I wrote free market but distributed wealth, which I think is basically him talking about progressive taxation. So he's talking about equal citizenship, and this is where he gets even wordier again. This is, I think, where he's talking. I don't think he's talking about the first section of the second principle. I think he's talking about the second part, which is where we may wish to sort of do some sort of affirmative action type thing. And this is where he's saying it would be just to do this because it mitigates the effect of natural accident or social circumstances. He doesn't want people benefiting overtly or too much in ways that do not also help others. And in that way we are not rewarding people for things that they didn't earn. So your natural endowments, your class and family circumstance and that kind of thing. So I wrote, no one should benefit from natural contingencies save where it would benefit others. Yeah, and this was also a small section. So the next section is the tendency to equality. He lays out that the difference principle is not the principle of redress, even if it achieves some of its intents. So where does he talk about the principle of redress? It's the principle that undeserved equalities call for redress, and since inequalities of birth and natural endowment are undeserved, these inequalities are to be compensated for. Thus, the principle holds that in order to treat all persons equally, to provide genuine equality of opportunity, society must give more attention to those with fewer native assets and to those born into less favorable situations. The idea is to redress the bias of contingencies in the direction of equality. In pursuit of this principle, greater resources might be spent on the education of the less rather than the more intelligent, at least over a certain time of life. And I don't think he wants that last part. I don't think he wants us giving more attention, or does he? I don't know. Does he want a direct? He says, because he says the natural distribution of endowments is neither just or unjust, but how institutions deal with those distributions is what is just or unjust. But why does he to try to even out handicapers or compete on a fair basis of race? He said it does not require society to try to even out handicaps as if all were expected to compete on a fair basis in the same race. It just means it's going to allocate resources in education, for instance, to improve the long-term expectations of the least favored.
Okay. So yeah, that means I mean that ultimately means like, you know what? There's gonna be certain people in our society that we can't raise to the same level, but we should raise them to the level we can. Like for them to have for everybody to have, you know, a sense of self-accomplishment, for everybody to contribute in their way. We need to raise everybody to the level they need to, but we may not necessarily get everybody to the same level. Mm-hmm. That's what he's trying to say there?
I think so. Because he says they're not, the principle of redress and his difference principle are not the same. Maybe it's the justification given that makes them not the same. So he makes the point that I say this is an anti-libertarian claim that he says. So he says people with greater advantages should view that as their compensation in the face of those benefits going to the least advantage.
Okay. Yeah. So that's basically saying like, hey, yeah, you've got it well. You're rich. You have all of these good things.
Right.
That's your benefit.
Like, we're going to help these other people. You're fine.
Yeah, like, yeah. So yeah, basically that just means that like rich people can still exist.
Right.
Is kind of the argument there, right? Like it's, you know, it's a true socialist doesn't hate the rich. They just want the poor to actually be, you know, well off as well, right? Like that's kind of the point there, I think.
Yeah, and I think he also says that not that the better off are obligated to think this way, but that they should think this way. And I think he says that. He says that the family unit is a natural expression of the difference principle because it's sort of the easy thought of that is sort of the parents to the children, because obviously the children don't have anything to do except for to rely on the parents. But I think he's also meaning like, let's say you're the one in the family that has like a really good job, and that you have like you know, kind of a shitbird cousin, but you should try to help him out. Or that like the prodigal son sort of situation where you should be okay with helping out your like your brother who's not had a good time of it because you have had a good time of it, and that you have enough to share, I guess.
Yeah, it really comes down to that, like, equality sort of justice thing that he kind of really regularly repeats, where it's like, it's always easier for the best off of us to give a little bit compared to the worst off of us not having it.
Yeah. He says any scheme to regulate natural endowment should be consensual, and I think that's why that is why he says that the best off should view this in this way, that they should assent to this system, because you don't deserve your natural capacities. You didn't earn them, essentially, and you didn't for the most part, you didn't earn your starting place in society, and so you shouldn't feel that you've earned that.
Yeah, that's a good throwback to the original position.
Yeah. Which is the next chapter, which I'm very excited to read.
Okay, call forward, I guess.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to the next section, excuse me. Principles for individuals and the principle of fairness. So this is where he talks about the institutional principles are hierarchically greater than principles for individuals. Because he thinks that essentially principles for institutions, essentially having a just society level, is far more important than, I guess, having the just interaction between individuals, because then the society will be able to sort that out. So part of his conception of what the principle should be for individuals is that one is not to gain from the cooperative labors without doing your fair share. So essentially, don't be a layabout and expect to get a lot from it. You need to add to the society, essentially. And he sees that as an obligation to you, that you should think you should be doing that. This is where he talks about no obligation to unjust institutions, and so like you should not feel that you need to add to or otherwise further the goals of an institution that does not take you into account, I guess, is a way to put it. Because an unjust I get, maybe, I don't know, does he say? I hate to have dead air, but it's a book club and we gotta read. Let's see. So all obligations arise. The requirements specified by the principle of fairness are the obligations. All the obligations arise in this way. It is important, however, to note that the principle of fairness has two parts. The first, which states that the institutions or practices in question must be just. The second, which characterizes the requisite voluntary acts. The first part formulates the conditions necessary if these voluntary acts are to give rise to obligations. With the principle of fairness, it is not possible to be bound to unjust institutions, or at least to institutions which exceed the limits of tolerable injustice. So he's saying even if a institution is not unjust in its founding, if it's exceeding the limits of tolerable injustice, you should also feel that that is unjust. You have no obligation to autocratic or arbitrary forms of government, because there does not exist the situation for the obligation to arise from consensual acts or other acts. Obligatory ties presuppose that the institution is just. It is therefore a mistake to argue against justice as fairness and contract theories that they have the consequence that all citizens under an obligation to unjust regimes. So he doesn't think that. So I guess people in arguing against contract theory were saying that people who may not have felt like they assented to whatever social contract had an obligation to it. But he's saying as long as those contracts were just, or at least the regime was just, as long as your consent was not coerced, you should have some form of obligation to it. Okay. But he's saying that his principle of fairness covers why you should be obligated to it. Maybe I'll have to reread that section. All right. Well, let's move on to the last section, where it says principles for individuals, the natural duties. And I found this section really good. So he thinks that the natural duties are helping others who are in jeopardy, provided it doesn't have excessive risks or loss to yourself. You have a duty not to harm or injure others, and you have a duty not to cause unnecessary suffering. And he does not think that you have to be obligated to do these things. Everyone should just do these things. He says there's no previous commitment to do these things. It's just equally held that we should all be doing them. And people who are gaining from a system likely incur more obligation as long as that system is just. And he talks about, so he has he has this chart here where he lays out top to bottom and I think left to right the hierarchies of the different things. And so practical reasoning is at the top, concepts of values, rights, and moral worth, and so he has social systems and institutions, and that's where justice and efficiency, and they're left to right, justice and then efficiency, and then individuals. But if you look at this track, so individuals, permissions, and then indifference or things that are supererogatory. He talks about what our duties are to things that we might consider supererogatory. And so supererogatory things are things that it is good to do, but that you are not obligated to do. And I think indifference is sort of the opposite of that. Like, you are not obligated to care, but it's nice that if you do care. And so he puts natural duties in contrast with obligations. They apply to you without regard to your voluntary acts. They have no connection with institutions or social practices. Their content is not in general defined by the rules of these arrangements. You have a natural, so he's saying that these are like almost like when Christians talk about your natural rights, like these are your natural duties. These just come about. You have a natural duty not to be cruel and a duty to help others. It is not a defense or excuse to say that you have made no promise not to be cruel or vindictive or to come to another person's aid. Indeed, a promise not to kill, for example, is normally ludicrously redundant. The suggestion that it establishes a moral requirement when none already existed is mistaken. So he's definitely a moral realist, I think. And he thinks that I would say I don't want to say he thinks they arise out of nothing, because I think he thinks they arise out of the natural order of things. Such promises in order to just a special reason. Yeah, because he's saying you know it doesn't imply in all for instance the principle not to harm others. You would not incur that duty in a just war because you are or coming to the aid of another who is being attacked and attacking their attacker. You do not have that duty to not harm their attacker. They hold between people irrespective of their institutional relationships. In regards to them, we are all equal moral persons. They apply to people generally, which I'm just sort of restating stuff. Particular objective natural. So he's saying your fundamental duties is because it's the duty of justice. It requires us to support and comply with a just institution that exists and applies to us. So again, if you had an unjust institution, that doesn't apply to you, and so you don't have the requirement to support and comply with that. Where does he talk about supererogatory things? Yep, have a good one, Luke. This will be done in just a second, because this is the last section. He talks about utilitarianism again, and he's saying utilitarianism cannot account for supererogatory actions, because in utilitarianism, you're just trying to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. So a thoroughgoing utilitarianism would do something, would do those acts regardless of the cost to you. And in here he is saying that under justice as fairness, you are not required to throw yourself in front of the bus to push another person out, because that is of great risk to you, but that is supererogatory. So it's not required of you, but if you want to do it, whatever. So that's the end of this chapter. The next chapter is about the original position, and I'm very excited. And I hope everybody joins us for that. And that is the end of our stream for today. Thanks for watching.